Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video it is something very special because I'll be talking about this camera right here. It's the Canon Powershot G12. Now this camera came out way back in 2010, so it's been quite a long time ago since this camera came out, but to be honest, if you're not really requiring a lot out of a compact camera, I feel like this camera is still a very good camera to go for. That being said though, as in my previous video, compact camera video, I was talking about the G11, and if you just want to save a few dollars or a few bucks or a few euros or what have you, this camera is still another great choice. That being said, this camera obviously comes with a minor upgrade, and you know, if those upgrades really mean a lot to you, it is still probably worth to actually look into this camera as well, because it is at the end of the day still a very capable camera to use. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon Powershot G12, now this camera came out way back in 2010 as mentioned earlier. That being said, despite being in generation after the G11 right here, it doesn't really come out with a lot of major upgrades to it. It only has like the HD video recording and stereo microphones and, you know, some other minor upgrades like having this front dials and better finishing and more grippy designs out here, and yeah, just everything else a little bit minor that you don't really have to upgrade to the G12 to. That being said, in this video I'll be sharing with you guys my opinions about this camera, my thoughts about this camera based on how I use this camera. And then as usual, I'll be dividing this video into 3 different sections. The first one will be about the ergonomics and the usability, and then followed by the image quality for both photography and video, and then followed by the conclusion, what I think about this camera, why I still actually recommend it, and why it might not be so good for some of you guys out there. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the first one, which is the ergonomics and the usability. The ergonomics of this camera is actually very nice. It feels much more refined and also much more grippy than the G11. They really fix a lot of things that weren't so well on the G11, let's put it that way. For example, this flush screen is not really flush, and it's just, you know, creating that very insecure feeling when you're gripping with your hand. And also this is a bit slippery, so in order to grip it a bit more, you have to press it a little bit harder, which means that you could easily press on any of these buttons, dials, D-pad, things like that. So it was very uncomfortable after a long period of time of using this camera. Whereas with this camera, they really changed the texture of the camera. It's a bit more grippy, and it's a bit not as glossy finish. And also the screen is a bit more flush, and there's a lock now, so you don't need to worry about, you know, the screen protruding out a little bit. I mean, the screen still protrudes out a little bit, but not to the point where, you know, your thumb would slowly just start pressing harder and harder onto this thumb rest right here. And talking about the thumb rest, there's actually a nice grippy thumb rest here now that it's actually, you know, aiding that slippery feeling, that it doesn't feel as slippery as the G11, and it actually feels very grippy. And also it's grippy to the point where you don't really need to apply a lot of pressure onto the grip nor onto the actual thumb rest here, therefore avoiding pressing on any of these buttons by accident, which is actually pretty good because, you know, these buttons are still big and it's also very comfortable as well. But, you know, if you don't have to really press or put any pressure on the grip, it's just you're not going to be pressing on these buttons by accident. And talking about buttons, they all feel very nice and has very nice tactile feel to them, and it's just a very responsive feeling to these buttons, which are actually quite nice. And to a certain extent, they do feel a tiny bit more responsive and a tiny bit better than the G11's buttons do. So that's actually quite nice. And if you're working or operating this camera in the cold weather with really thick winter gloves, you still can press on these buttons very well. And, you know, you still will be able to control the camera quite nicely as well, which is very good. This camera brought a first in terms of design for the G series. So it has this front dial, which can actually be very useful if you're adjusting either your aperture or your shutter speed, depending on which mode you're in, things like that. So it can be very useful as well, and it can actually jump through the images as well. So that is really good. And yeah, I'm surprised it actually took them this long to actually implement this feature. But another welcome feature is of course the stereo mic when you're shooting video. Of course, being an onboard microphone, it's still not that good, but it is still a huge improvement over the G11, especially when this camera can actually shoot in HD now. It's still not full HD, but it's HD, so if you're into that, then yeah, this does it, coupled with the fact that it does deliver a really nice vintage digital look to it as well. But I'll talk about that more later in the image quality section. And moving on to the next point is the lens. It's still pretty much the same lens as on the G10 and the G11, so not much has changed there. It's still the 28 to 140 millimeter lens with the f2.8 to f4.5, so it's not really that bright when it zooms in all the way to 140 millimeter. I wish that they would already actually come up with the newer lens they actually had placed on the G16, which is the f1.8 to f2.8. That would actually have been a much better lens, especially for such an old sensor like this one. So you wouldn't have to use a lot of the higher ISO settings, especially in low light situations, therefore would reduce a lot of noise in the image as well, especially in low light. But yeah, it is what it is. But the lens has a very nice image stabilization as well built into the lens, which is pretty good. It's very powerful as well, the image stabilization or the IS, and you can work with the slow shutter speed in photography, or you can actually smoothly zoom in with video. Well, when you're actually taking video, you can actually see the IS working very nicely and trying to stabilize your images as you actually, you know, zoom into the video or zoom into the any location you're actually filming at. So yeah, that's actually quite good as well. But otherwise, the zoom is actually very versatile, and you actually start from kind of semi-wide to kind of semi-telephoto, so it's actually very versatile in such a small package, so that's actually quite nice. And this, talking about package, is actually a very small and light package as well. But back to the lens for a little bit. In front of the lens here, you actually have this ring so that you can actually mount different accessories in front of it, like lens hood or telephoto lens or wide angle lens and some other third-party accessories on here as well. And you know, you can actually just close this back. Although sometimes I do just wish that it would just be some sort of a control ring out here, but you know, it is what it is. And I guess it's also good that it actually allows people to adapt other accessories in here. And being one of the more popular cameras, especially being a camera that many other G series kind of have this similar design to, there are a lot of accessories still available out there in the market that you can actually adapt to this camera. So that's actually quite good as well. In front here is actually a rangefinder viewfinder. It's actually optical viewfinder, but it doesn't look through this lens obviously, but it does zoom as you zoom with the actual lens. So you have to look through this viewfinder here, and when you zoom in or zoom out, it will actually zoom with the focal range as well. But because it's not looking through the actual lens right here, you're only getting like a very, very close representation of what you're actually framing with the lens. So just keep that in mind. And moving on to the next point, which is the flash right here in the front. It is very close to the lens though. That means that if you're taking portraits at night, especially at night, there's a much higher chance of getting that red eye effect. Whereas if the flash were to be like, let's say with a G16, when it's actually a bit higher, the higher the flash is and the further away the flash is from the lens, the lesser chance that the red eye effect will be pronounced in the images. That being said, you know, if you're not really photographing a lot of portraits with the flashes, then you don't really need to worry about that feature. So yeah, there is that, but the flash is there when you need it. And there is the AF assist lamp beam right here, which is actually pretty good. It's not too bright that it would actually blind your subject, which is good, and it's not too dim that the autofocusing system wouldn't be able to focus in low light, so that's actually quite nice and neat as well. Moving to the bottom of the camera, as my complaint with all of the, well, most of the G series cameras at least, is that the tripod mount is very close, well, right next to the battery and the SD card compartment, which means that if you do have this camera on the tripod doing long exposure, and if you need to change your either memory card or your battery, imagine there's a plate or a tripod down here, and you try to replace it, yeah, it's kind of like stuck. So you have to still unmount the camera from the tripod, or just take off the tripod plate out of here and replace the battery or the memory card or what have you. So yeah, it's a bit cumbersome. And I also just wish that the tripod mount would be right in the center of the the center of the sensor. So if you're doing panorama, well, manual panorama mode, then you can actually avoid a lot of the parallax as well. So yeah, there's that, but that is something very nitpicking, and it's also very niche as well. But back to the battery life on this camera is actually pretty good. You can actually operate this camera in very cold temperature as well as a very, very warm temperature as well. And the battery would still last, and you know, for the most part, it's actually very accurate. It's only that after the first 75% of the battery is used up, the last 25% seems to go by quite quickly. So just be careful, and I would recommend bringing like 2 or 3 extra batteries if you still want to enjoy using this camera during the day. So yeah, there is that for the bottom part. Onto the back, all the button layouts are very logically and efficiently arranged, so that's actually quite nice. Everything is pretty much at your fingertips. As I mentioned earlier, everything has a very tactile feel to it. It's very responsive, very nice. All the dials up here though, they're also very, very nice, and you can actually turn them very nicely, and it's all very deliberate as well. And it's a tiny bit more stiff than the G11, but it is still very, very nice, and you're not going to be knocking them by accident a lot of times, so that's also pretty good. That being said, if you're recording video, please don't change these dials because the microphones are right next to the dials really, so you will record that quite apparent as well. So yeah, and the zoom lever here is also quite nice and not too stiff and not too smooth, so everything is just really nicely designed and organized and polished. So I really like that about this particular camera, and yeah, it's just more refined compared to the actual G11. It feels like a G11 Lite, not Lite, the G11S or something. It should be G12, it's just like a G11S, because a lot of the features on this camera is pretty much still the same or very similar to the G11, just that everything is more polished, more refined. It's not, well, it doesn't seem like a major upgrade to the camera. There's that. But the screen in the back here, it's also very nice. It's a fully articulated screen. It's 2.8 inches, just like on the G11. So it is still quite nice, and you still can see your images even in bright sunlight condition. But if you're of course in bright sunlight, let's say in tropical countries, that's where the sunlight is a lot more strong than here in Northern Europe, then you might actually have to shield your screen a little bit just to see it better. But you know, in normal lighting condition, you would still be able to see your screen quite nicely as well. It's not too reflective. Even if you're actually shooting in low light, you would still be able to get really nice refresh rate with the screen. So that's also very nice, and you still can actually judge the details of the images, judge the exposure, judge the contrast, and pretty much the color accuracy quite well. The only time when it's a little bit challenging is, of course, when you're actually working in direct sunlight, where you might actually have to shield the screen a little bit. And of course, that's when it gets a little bit tricky, but otherwise the contrast, the color reproduction, the color details of the screen is actually pretty good. And yeah, otherwise onto a more software related and the operational side of things related part of this camera. So this camera actually doesn't really have a lot of things that changed over the G11. The menu is pretty much the same, but that being said, it's still very friendly and efficiently organized, whether it's the actual quick access menu or the actual menu page itself. It's very efficiently laid out and also very efficiently designed and categorized as well as organized. So it's actually very good. So when you're actually operating with this camera, especially out there in the field, it feels more like it's part of you and it's not trying to get in the way of your photograph. So that's actually pretty good. And especially if you just want to access something really quickly, then it's also very nice and quick as well, because the naming on the menu system here are actually also very logically named, unlike some other brands. So it's also very good to get onto your settings. For example, if you just want to limit your ISO limiter, you can actually do that really quickly, under 30 seconds. So that's actually great. And onto the next point, which is the autofocusing system. The autofocusing system on this camera is very, very similar to the one on the G11. I would say it's a tad faster. Maybe it's just a feeling, but it just feels like a hair faster. But that's actually not really a bad thing, simply because it is quite an accurate system as well, because you can actually focus on a lot of subjects quite nicely and accurately as well. The only time when it's actually quite weak is when you're actually tracking, let's say, moving subject. That's when it's a little bit too much for this camera to kind of handle, simply because it's not really a sports camera, let's just put it that way. And if you want to track something that's moving towards you, or you know, from side to side, it's a little bit tricky for the camera to actually handle that. But on a more still subject, it is going to perform quite nicely and accurately. The only other weakness is also in low light situations, where, you know, if you don't want to use the AF assistant beam, or if the subject is really far away, let's say like a really dark landscape subject, then of course the autofocusing system on here will actually be struggling a little bit to actually try to get everything in focus, or at least the area that you want to be in focus. So yeah, that's the only weakness, but otherwise a lot of the other operational side of things are very, very similar. So it still only shoots at 1.1 frames per second, pretty much the same as the G11 right here, and the zoom range is the same, the buffer is very similar. So yeah, it's just all a more refined camera, as I kind of mentioned earlier. The only feature that it adds more, of course, is you can now shoot in different aspect ratios. So for example, the G11 would only allow you to shoot at 4:3 or 16:9. With this, it allows you to shoot at around 1:1, 5:2, 4:3, 3:2, and of course 16:9, like a wide angle kind of aspect ratio. So yeah, you do have more options with this camera, but in the same time, it doesn't really matter much, because if you still want to take control or take advantage of the full resolution, you'll be shooting at resolution of 4:3 anyway, because that's pretty much the dimension of the sensor itself. So yeah, if you want to take the advantage of that resolution, then you really have to shoot at the native aspect ratio. So yeah, and now moving into the image quality for photography side of things, this camera actually still produces very, very similar, in fact, very identical results to the G11. In my finding, I couldn't actually see that much of a difference between the two images. Maybe there were tweaks here and there, but it was very minor, and especially when I actually shoot raw only with this camera, it's really hard to see the difference, because if you shoot JPEG, sure, they might actually have done some tweaking to different color profiles, different picture profiles, things like that per JPEG images. But in terms of like just shooting raw and putting on into Lightroom and just seeing the raw file, it looks pretty much the same and it's indistinguishable. So there's that. And of course, this camera, even though it doesn't really have such an improvement in terms of image quality, actually barely any, it doesn't mean that it's bad, because the image quality you still can actually crop in quite a bit, especially if you only want to, you know, post these images onto your social media, share them with family and friends. 10 megapixel is still a lot of resolution to really play with. If you think that videos like 4K video is such a high resolution, well, it's only 8 megapixels, roughly, approximately. So if you think that that's pretty high, then 10 megapixel is a lot. So you definitely have a lot of room to crop there. And if you just want to print, you still can print out, fine print around A3 and A2 quite nicely. And if you're not so fine, then around A1 would also be very good as well. And the color reproduction on this camera is still very nice. The color depth is good and the color science is good. And just like with this camera, you still get that kind of old vintage digital look of a compact camera to this one, albeit with a much modern camera. So unlike with cameras, for example, the G1 right here, the original G1, where it's only 3.3 megapixels, you're getting 10 megapixels on this. I almost dropped this camera. You're getting like 10 megapixels on this camera, which is much more than enough to actually play around with and also just do some basic manipulation, because the file out of this camera, especially the raw file, is actually very robust as well. And now more into the weakness side of things. Well, the low light capability, I wouldn't use it over ISO 800 on this camera, personally speaking, because above 800 or even above 400 you start seeing noise, but above 800 you'll see a lot of noise. So just be careful with this camera a little bit. But of course, if you're not planning to, let's say, print an A1 size picture, or if you're not planning to like blow it up on, let's say, a 5K monitor, just use it on just day-to-day basis and just post it on social media, you still can trade in some of that resolution for the denoising feature. So you'll get a much cleaner image at the end of the day out of this camera as well, because 10 megapixel is still a lot of resolution to play with, and you still can, as I mentioned earlier, just trade in some of that resolution for the denoising for a much cleaner image in post processing, assuming you actually shoot in RAW for that maximum advantage taking, so to speak. And now moving on to the next point, which is somewhat negative as well, which is moire and aliasing. Now this is an old camera, and of course I don't expect it to, you know, perform well with moire and aliasing, but in the same time, for the camera and for the age of the camera, I think that it actually performs very well. Just you will still notice moire and aliasing coming out of this camera, especially if you shoot a lot of very fine detail patterns, things like that. You will see that. And even though it's really well controlled when it comes to, let's say, if you're photographing buildings with a lot of fine bricks pattern, things like that, but if you're photographing a lot of fabric, so to speak, with a lot of very fine patterns and very complex and fine detail of those patterns as well, you will start to see some of moire and aliasing creeping in parts of the images as well. So just watch out for that and be very, very careful. But otherwise, the color science, the contrast, the color reproduction is great. The rendition between different tones is also pretty good, as well as the rendition of the details of those tones. They're just really nice out of this camera, assuming you know what you're doing, of course, because personally I don't shoot in auto mode, so I can't really judge for that. But in the same time, if you just shoot in like manual mode or semi-manual mode, things like that, you will be able to control your outcome a lot better, and therefore, you know, the camera will actually have to do less thinking for you, and you just do the main thinking part, and then you can just come back with, you know, a more pleasing results that you actually have the control over. So yeah, there's that. And now moving on to the video side of things. The video side of things, it's actually very, very similar to the photography side of things. So a lot of things that I've already mentioned in photography can actually apply to the filmmaking side, well, the video side of this camera. Now keep in mind, this camera doesn't shoot full HD, it only does HD video, which is 720p at only 24 or 25 frames per second, around that. So you can't really do slow motion with this camera, and it doesn't really have a lot of essential video features in this camera anyway, so you can't even plug in your external mic onto this camera and record audio with a more professional mic, things like that. So don't expect things to be too serious, but in the same time, if you're only really looking for that vintage digital look, even in video, you will still get it with this camera. And of course, if you're looking to that kind of vintage video, you're probably going to be pleased with the softness coming out of this camera anyway, because the 720p in this day and age is actually really quite soft. Especially, for example, with a 4K monitor in the background, it will be extra soft. But of course, you will still get the advantage of having that really nice Canon color science and also really nice color reproduction in here as well. The only downside is also the dynamic range. Of course, in photography, the dynamic range is not that great anyway. It's still good, but not that great. But in video, it's just so much worse, simply because it is a baked and compressed, heavily compressed file for video. So the dynamic range won't really be there. And if you try to tweak it later in post, there's really lack of detail or lack of information to really grab back or pull back or recover back. So just keep that in mind. If you're taking videos, just make sure that the exposure is as close to as what you want in your head already. Otherwise, everything will just be either blown out or underexposed, and you can't really recover that later, so just be careful of that. But otherwise, the autofocusing system in video mode will also perform quite nicely and smoothly as well, although not always accurate. Just keep that in mind because it is an old camera. But in the same time, it's also a very nice overall system to control, and you know, just watch out for basic things like moire and aliasing as well, because those problems or those issues will only be more magnified or more pronounced in the video mode, simply because the file is more baked in and also more compressed as well. So just watch out for those. But then again, just to recap, if you can actually get over, you know, the moire and aliasing on this camera, if you know what you're doing, and also if you can get over the fact that it is only 720p and also the dynamic range isn't so great, especially in video, the color science, the color reproduction, the color rendition, the roll off into the highlights and shadows are quite nice and also natural as well. All of those things are still quite nice out of this camera. So yeah, and as I'm slowly hinting into the conclusion, just to conclude this video overall, this camera is still indeed a very powerful and very nice camera to use under, you know, 80 euros. Or even under 100 euros, depending on the condition and also the region you actually buy this camera from. And I would actually highly recommend this camera. The only reason I might actually not recommend this camera, and if you would like to save more money, then maybe go for the G11, because I don't think personally that 720p video is really worth spending that extra money. And maybe this dial can also be, you know, overlooked or just ignored if you don't really have experience with dual dials before. You can still get away with just having one rear dial here. And you know, the image quality is still pretty much the same in photography, and the menu system, things like that, is still very much the same. And, you know, personally, I stick with the native aspect ratio of the camera anyway. If I want to crop, I tend to crop later in post. So having the extra cropping features in this camera just doesn't really matter to me as much as, let's say, with just using the native aspect ratio on this camera. So yeah, there is that. Otherwise, the resolution, the lens, the performance is pretty much almost identical. But if the extra, you know, upgrade on this camera, if the feeling suits you better and the operational side of things suits you better with that minor upgrade, then by all means go for this camera, because it is only like 10 or 20 euros more than this camera, so it's not a lot more, so to speak. And of course, you will get the benefit of the 720p video as well, should you wish to use it as well in the future. But yeah, otherwise, it's a really nice camera to also consider, because as I mentioned earlier, with the manual control, how everything works really nicely, and everything just works very seamlessly together. And it's another camera that kind of freshen up your mind a little bit, because you're working with a lot of the limitations that this camera has to offer. And yeah, coming from a system like the A7 IV, the R5, R6, original R, you know, sometimes you just need that refreshment, or just some cameras that would actually freshen up your mind, see a different new perspective because of the limitations and also the form factors that it actually offers, because this camera is actually very nice, light and portable. I usually just put it into the trouser pocket and it would just be fine. And yeah, if I just need to snap this shot, that shot, I can just grab it out and then just snap, snap, snap. And of course, that way I will also actually get more images back home anyway. And of course, because these images are different than, let's say, images coming out of my iPhone or my DSLRs or my other mirrorless cameras, it just provides a very different feel to it, and therefore the thought process, the thinking process, and everything is just going to be very different when using this camera as well. So, you know, if you just want to experiment into this kind of camera, or even get a feel of having that vintage digital look without having too old of a sensor that the file wouldn't be as robust as, you know, this camera, then, you know, this camera is also another good option to look at. Well, so is the G11, to be honest with you guys. So yeah, there's that. And before this video gets any longer, I would like to actually end it here. This is again not a full in-depth review video. It's only based on my experience using this camera, based on my thoughts, my pros and my cons, things like that. I hope that it actually helped some of you guys out. But yeah, otherwise, if you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. Just click in the link down in the description section below. You don't need to submit your email address, nothing, and I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. So just, yeah, click and download if you want to. And also, if you have any suggestions, any story to share, any experience to share, any questions, any recommendations, things like that, feel free to actually comment down in the comment section down below as well. Otherwise, I thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.